afternoon. I'm here with CCG Analytics and Tony Williams, who runs our data governance and data quality practice. Good afternoon, Tony.
Good afternoon.
You look super comfortable in that very tiny chair. Should have gotten you a bigger chair. Let's start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, well, the last 13 or so years I've been mostly working in data warehouse and business intelligence. And before that, I've had a pretty typical developer, application developer, programmer analyst career, worked my way up through the ranks. I loved leading teams to build things and develop things, and I still do. My first, since we're talking about data governance, my first taste of data governance was working in a very large financial institution. And I was an architect and application developer lead for a set of data marts. And we put in place some procedures, process, et cetera, around managing what was coming at us in order for requests year over year. And in order to manage that, and we did it across our entire organization of about 120 BI professionals, including our data marts. And we put that in place and to help us manage from a budgetary process what was happening, what kind of money we were going to spend, and that sort of thing. And then we realized that we had to actually have a little bit of ownership defined around all the different data we had, because different groups wanted to do different things with the data. So
Right.
that was my first taste of it, where we stood up a little bit of what I would call local governance around that, so we could actually manage our budget process more than anything else, and keep track of what folks were asking for access to what types of data and to do what with it. And the good thing about that, what ended up coming out of that, the most important thing, was that there were certain groups that were asking for data they shouldn't have had access to.
Correct.
So that was my first exposure to that.
And that's when you fell in love with data governance?
Well, I don't know if I fell in love with it, but I started to recognize the importance of it.
Yes. And we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we'll start with a simple question. Tell us what data governance is to you.
Okay, well, data governance, very simply, it's the framework and structure of policy, standards, and process, procedure, roles and responsibility around all the information assets in an organization, so you can actually wring value out of them.
Absolutely.
In some form, right? So.
And I think I know the answer to this, but the importance of data governance today is tied around the enormous amount of data each company has. But why don't you tell us a little bit about why it's so important to govern your data?
Well, first of all, data is growing so fast, and what we used to call data and what we call data now are kind of two different things. We used to have very discrete data in large companies and small companies. Now it's content.
Correct.
Right? It's structured, it's unstructured.
Correct.
How we manage that and how we control it has gotten more and more challenging. And it tends to grow at 20 to 40% a year over year.
Absolutely.
So we're also headed towards more and more companies trying to figure out how to use that data for strategic purposes of all sorts, right? And that's where business intelligence and now the advanced analytics is coming in, right? So in order to get that value out of that data, you have to understand where it came from, how it got in the state it's in, and how good it is in order to answer questions.
Yeah.
And if you don't put some governance around it, and then out of the governance comes the management around it, which is more important, you're not going to get there, right? And eventually what you want to be able to do is a couple different things. Change the culture so people understand what their responsibilities are around data. And two, eventually, every major company, big and small, needs to have a line item on their annual report that says, this is the value of our data to our corporation, right? And most companies can't do that. So.
Agreed. And your practice is not just data governance, it's also data quality.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the importance of data quality and how those two combine together or interrelate.
Yeah, I'm fond of saying you can't implement data governance without taking data quality into account, or vice versa. You shouldn't do one without the other. The management of data is all around figuring out what we can use it to make decisions with, right? And if you don't have high enough confidence in that,
Mm-hmm.
then you're not going to rely on it.
Absolutely.
And that's where the data quality part comes in.
Mm-hmm.
The data inherently doesn't have any quality to it. It's when you try to make a decision with it. Can you make a decision with it and feel comfortable with it, right? So it's that part of the quality we're looking at. And then without the other doesn't make sense. You can't get the higher quality. You can't drive to the decisions you want to make with your data without governing the process that the data gets there. And then the important part about data quality is not so much that this number is what it needs to be. It's how we measure the entire breadth and depth of all of that data,
Absolutely.
right? So that you can get to the front end of some dashboard somewhere and go, yeah, we have about 90% confidence in this metric right here,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how do you get there? That's the important side of data quality, is the measurement of the whole thing.
Totally agree.
So,
Yeah, we spoke earlier to Brian Beasley, who explained in depth that you just can't successfully do machine learning without quality data. So that's one example of
sure.
an emerging technology that you can't even use if you don't have data quality. So thank you for that explanation. You've got a wonderful framework for data governance that you've shared with many, many companies, and it's a very successful framework. Tell me a little bit about what you believe the most important component. I know there's many components to it. What are your top 2 or 3 favorite components of data governance that if you had limited time and money to implement data governance, where would you start, Tony?
Well, the idea behind governance is to set up something that's sustainable, right? So you've got to have some form of governing body, and that has to meet on a regular cadence, and it has to have basically an agenda and that sort of thing to follow. So that's kind of number one. If you're not doing that,
Mm-hmm.
then you don't have any, and it needs to have the right level of executives involved so that you have that enterprise buy-in, right? You have the executive authority that goes with it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one. Number 2 is all this kind of stuff that goes underneath it, the councils, the working groups, and that's different organization to organization, depends on what you're trying to do.
Absolutely.
Right? But that's kind of, you got to have that, and that's the what I said first, right? That's more your executive steering. That's the pure governance side of it for the most part, right? The councils and stuff are more the management side of it. That's the interaction with the business. It's the interaction with IT management functions, right? Your data architecture, your data modeling, your warehousing and business intelligence, all those things, security, all those things, you're involved in all that stuff. So then the third thing, which is often way overlooked, is an effective communication program.
Oh, that's huge.
Right? You got to set that up in the beginning when you're laying out how you're going to implement data governance. And then once you get that framework set up, that communication framework set up, you got to execute on it, and you got to keep executing on it. You got to keep showing how you're adding value to the organization with governance.
And not just communication, I agree with you 100%, but also in some cases organizational change management, because this may be a difference in the way you've held power in your department before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now all of a sudden somebody else is checking on your data and somebody else is telling you how to manage it, and it makes you feel uncomfortable, but it's the best thing for the entire company.
Yep.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, that's organizational change management. The ability for an organization to change is the number one reason data governance will stall.
Absolutely.
Right. And one of the important things about doing this type of work is going in and assessing that up front.
Absolutely.
Because if you look at it early enough and you see there's this organization is slow to change, doesn't adapt well to change, all that sort of thing, you can build that into the roadmap, right? How do we get it so they can do this? Automatically it's probably going to take longer, right? And how do you do that? So, that organizational change management part is probably the most difficult part. A lot of the rest of it, early on, you can stand up a lot of things that are relatively easy to stand up and add value pretty quickly. Getting the rest of the organization to follow you is the difficult part.
Very good. And that was going to be my next question. How hard is it to implement data governance, and where should companies start? I think you answered most of that. Anything you want to add to that?
So, like anything, when a company hires a bunch of consultants to come in and do something, they want to see something relatively fast.
Correct. Value.
Right. So the idea behind the way we try to stand up data governance is to get in there, find a team that we can, a small team, it can be really small too, that will work through how we're going to implement, stand and operate as a little bit of a working group to start with, and then identify a small kind of interim steering committee that has authority to help this small team push the plan through. Out of this, you want to come up with a roadmap that says this is how we're going to implement data governance, and you usually need to take into account all the data domains, all the major programs, and then all the organizations. Those three kind of different directions, how you're going to roll those out one after the other until you've got the entire organization covered. So you can stand up a bunch of stuff early, use that implementation team to kind of figure out what it is we need to do, figure out all of the assessments that need to be done that we talked about around whether the organization can change, start collecting all of the major data quality issues, right? Those sorts of things, start to get a backlog of things around data governance.
Correct.
And then use that interim governance committee to give you the authority to act. And then when you're ready, you got a roadmap laid out, execute it. Eventually that implementation team goes away. That interim governance committee gets replaced by the permanent one. And the whole idea is that we trying to get data governance to be the closest equivalent in corporate terms is to be like accounting and finance. Everybody knows, every employee knows their responsibility around accounting data, right?
Correct.
They've got to enter time, they've got to do this, they've got to do that, there's project budgets, all that sort of stuff. Same thing with governance. You don't want governance to be intrusive, data governance in particular. You want it to become part of the fabric of what you do.
Of the culture.
Yeah.
Agreed. And I don't think that you need a tool to implement data governance. I know in some cases with larger companies you have suggested a way to use systems to implement data governance, but what I want to be able to share with small companies is you don't need much other than a framework to start. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
You really don't. Most of the tools you need are already there. You've got
correct.
Office. Excel turns out to be a great tool for doing this thing. Existing tools that your PMO has.
Correct.
Will be useful.
A help desk tool to track
tool,
calls.
right.
We can track data quality that way.
You can track data quality. You can set up simple processes in those help desk tools. Those ticketing systems and all that stuff. Issue and risk management, that always comes up around these sorts of things. You just reuse the existing frameworks in place. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to stand up a lot of data governance.
Agreed.
Right? Most of the tools, you can reuse processes and procedures that are there. That allows you to focus on worrying about information ownership model, right? Setting up the accountability and the responsibility around the data and that sort of thing. And then start to focus on the softer side of it, which is the policies and that sort of stuff that needs to be written around, what we do with our data, right? So the carrot and the stick that goes with everything around data. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So my next question is all about, the return on investment on implementing data governance. I know you've seen some powerful returns. Talk to us a little bit without, having to share numbers, but what do you believe the ROI is on data governance?
Yeah, the
benefits.
The important thing about doing something like data governance is not to get too caught up in the financial ROI exactly, right? Where you typically will try to stand up data governance is because you've come to your own realization that you're trying to do something and something's getting in the way of you doing it. A lot of times it's data quality, right? You're trying to do a BI program or a master data management program and data quality is in the way. So a lot of what we see on the return on the investment is around what we do, showing that putting this framework in place around governance and management of data has solved these data quality issues. Those we can measure.
Absolutely.
Right down to penny if you want to, right?
Absolutely.
So that's usually the best way to show return on investment on it is find those nagging data quality issues, right? And you don't have to go far to find them. People will yell them at you, right? And if you can get your data governance and the data management side of it to handle those and show some real good, what the effect is of fixing all that bad data, if I want to just say it simply, then that's how one of the best ways to show return on investment, because you're not going to take the data governance budget and go, this is what it saved us. This is the
Correct.
additional revenue that we found because of it. No, it's gonna come up with the interface to the programs,
Mhm.
and it's gonna show up in all of the data quality issues that get handled.
You cannot turn data into information if it's lacking quality and if it's not governed. And without information, you can't make business decisions
Exactly.
and transform companies. So,
Exactly.
so thank you very much, Shoni. This was wonderful. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
And
William.
it was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.